Kylie. Appreciate that. Good. All right. So I've got this up in the background. I'm going to go ahead and get started. If there's some late joiners, that'll be fine. So welcome to Mushroom Growing 101. And this is really, I'm going to call it Mushroom Growing for Gardeners. This is a gardening series. I've been growing mushrooms for a while now in my kitchen in a specialized closet thing that I made. It's called a Martha fruiting chamber. But what I want to get into here is the more accessible version of mushroom growing. So if you're coming from a gardening background, I want you to be able to, at the end of this class, at least understand how to get into the first couple steps of mushroom growing and maybe augmenting your garden with mushrooms, rather than doing a full course where I explain all of the little nitty-gritty details. I'm going to try to keep this pretty high level. If you want any of the details, feel free to reach out on the chat or unmute yourself and ask a question. Happy to go into it more. Yeah, just in order to make sure this happens in a reasonable amount of time frame, and that it's not way too into the weeds for people who are normally gardeners. Yeah, just keeping it a little bit high level. So I'll go ahead and get started here. Welcome aboard. A little bit about myself. So those of you who joined early and saw Josh and I talking a little bit, Josh and I go way back. We co-founded the DC Urban Gardeners Network together, which is how I think a lot of you probably found out about this event today and the DPR series. And then my wife got into grad school out in Laramie, Wyoming. So I'm currently at the very end of a 2-year stint out in Laramie, Wyoming, where things do not grow well. And we have an 87-day growing season. So I'm looking forward to getting back into DC to do some real gardening next year. But in the meantime, I have learned how to grow mushrooms. So I spent about a year doing research on how to grow mushrooms before I finally took the plunge. And I kind of went into the deep end of it. I went into making my own spawn, and we'll talk about all this stuff. But I now fully understand the whole process of growing mushrooms that you guys don't need to understand in order to be able to successfully grow mushrooms. And I have been using, as I said before, this fruiting chamber in my kitchen, but I have done some outdoor beds. I've done some outdoor log mushroom farming, and that's the kind of stuff that I'm going to explain today. A little bit about this class. So first, we're going to do this in 2 parts. The first part is going to be about mushrooms themselves. What is a mushroom? What kind of characteristics define it? How do they grow? Their patterns? Because I'm going to assume a lot of people on this call know things about plants. And one of the big mistakes that I see from new mushroom farmers, new mushroom growers, is thinking that mushrooms behave like plants. And they don't. Mushrooms are not plants. And we'll go into that a little bit more detail as we get through part 1 to really just explain to you the background behind what mushrooms are, what fungus is, what mycelium is, what hyphae are. We'll go into the details on that. Part 2 is going to be how to get started. And as I said before, I'm not going to go into all the nitty-gritty details. There's a ton to learn. The rabbit hole goes very deep in this topic. If you get interested in fungi, there's more classes and more websites that I'll show you towards the end for additional resources, additional learning about how to do all this stuff. They're very fun to grow. They're very addictive to watch them grow, because unlike plants, where you sort of see a slow progression of fruits developing over a long period of time and then you harvest when they're ready, mushrooms look like they're doing nothing at all for a very long time, and then the fruits pop up almost overnight. It's very cool to watch, and it's a much more sort of longer wait to see the results. But then when you see the results, it happens so quickly that it's a very cool process. Yeah, and please ask questions. This is, this course is for you. Not me. I know this stuff already. So I really want to tailor this to what you guys want to know about it. So please, please, please ask questions in the chat. Unmute yourself, ask questions whenever you want. And hopefully we will have a good session and learn a bunch of stuff. All right, so part 1, what is a mushroom? First thing to know is that the mushroom is not the organism. So a lot of people confuse this. A lot of people think that the mushroom itself is the thing, that it grows out of the ground like a plant would. This is not the case. What's really happening is that there's an organism composed of mycelium. Mycelium is these little thread things. I'll show you a little bit of those later. And it's a mass of these little filaments that are individually called hyphae, and then when they all combine together, they become mycelium. Some fungi produce mushrooms, some don't. There are fungi out there like yeast that are actually fungi, but they divide instead of producing mushrooms. So mushrooms is one way that fungi have of reproducing themselves, but not everything does. And then conceptually, what you want to think of when you see a mushroom is it's like an apple from an apple tree. So underground, there's the whole tree, and then what you're seeing is just the apple popping out. And that becomes important because how you take care of the apple tree, of the underground, the mycelium, or the part that's in the log or the part that's rotting stuff, is different if you're thinking of that as the organism versus thinking of the mushroom as an organism. And then I said this already, but mushrooms are not plants. If you think of mushrooms as plants and you think of spores as seeds, you're already off in the bad direction. You really want to focus on mushrooms being completely different than plants. In fact, they're so different than plants that they are actually more closely related to humans than they are to plants. So fungi, for example, breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. So it's the opposite of plants. They don't have any kind of way of generating their own energy, so they eat things. The things that they eat tend to be either dead, decaying matter, and they're the ones that are actually doing the decaying. So they eat lignin, they eat cellulose, they eat starches, they eat a couple other things. And then but they're not eating the soil, and they're not pulling their energy from the sun. So it's very different from plants. They don't need NPK, or they do trace amounts, but adding fertilizer to your mushrooms is not going to help. They're very different than plants. And so there's a lot of confusion around that in terms of what I've seen on the forums, the kinds of questions people ask. A lot of the questions come from an understanding of what a plant does. And you're almost always on the wrong path if you're thinking of them as like a different kind of plant. It's not a different kind of plant. It's a whole different ballgame. All right. So there are two broad categories of fungi. One broad category is called mycorrhizal fungi. These fungi, and I'm going back and forth between fungi and fungi, and I read all this stuff all the time, but I don't know how any of this stuff is pronounced, so I could be wrong on any of it, just FYI. So mycorrhizal fungi form a relationship with a plant, and this could be a tree, it could be a small house plant, it could be, and when I say form a relationship, I mean a really intimate relationship. In a lot of these cases with mycorrhizal fungi, what happens is that the hyphae, the individual little threads and filaments, actually jam into the roots and go into the cells of the plant in order to have a nutrient exchange with that plant. This image here is of a mycorrhizal relationship, and actually, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not on here, but this piece here, which is sort of the middle piece, that's the root system, and everything else around it, this huge ring of whiteness, is fungi. It's these little hyphae that are going out deeper into the soil, finding nutrients and trading them with the plant in exchange for sugars. The reason that I'm breaking this down into these two broad categories is because a lot of the mushrooms that you might go out and forage or hear of people foraging, such as morels, porcini, king boletes, chanterelles, truffles, cauliflower mushrooms, matsutake, like there's a bunch of mushrooms out there that are mycorrhizal, and you can't grow these. You can, there's ways, there's methods, but you need the plants there. No one has been able to figure out how to grow these without creating this plant relationship. And so there will be fungi that you may be interested in growing that are on this list that you just can't grow. So, so that's one of the first things to look into if there's a species that you're interested in growing, first check whether it's mycorrhizal or saprotrophic. So saprotrophs are the decayers. They are the things that eat the leaf litter. They're the things that eat the dead trees. There's sort of a middle ground here where there's a couple fungi that will start eating live trees and then kill them and then eat the dead stuff also. They're parasitic fungi. Honey fungus is one of these. There's a lot of honey fungus in Rock Creek Park, actually. Yeah, so there's these saprotrophs. These are the guys that we can cultivate. These are the ones that we can go out and pull cultures from and then grow at home. And you can actually go out into the woods and get a lot of these mushrooms and take them and take little chunks of them and start growing them at home. There's one exception to this, which is that I'm aware of. There's probably more. Here's the list of saprobes: oysters are very common, shiitake, lion's mane, maitake, most of the mushrooms that you can get in the store, or you can get in a specialty store somewhere. These are going to be saprotrophs, unless somebody went out and foraged them. The exception here is that it's very easy to find a mushroom in the woods called chicken of the woods. It's Latoporus sulphureus or Latoporus cincinnatus. But those mushrooms, for some reason, we can't figure it out. There's something going on where we can't get the conditions quite right. Somebody at some point will figure out how to grow chicken of the woods. We're not there yet. So that's one that might pop up as something you would be interested in growing. It is a saprotroph, but we can't figure out how to make it grow yet. Any questions so far on the broad categories? All right. There's one more exception that I want to talk about, is that a lot of people, when they first start thinking about growing mushrooms, think about the mushrooms that they get in the store. Why can't I just grow white button mushrooms or portobellos or creminis at home? You know, I can get them in the store. Obviously, they're easy to grow because they're not that expensive. So why can't I grow them at home? The answer is that you can, but they're a different kind of saprotroph. So there's these two different kinds of saprotrophs. One is called a primary decomposer, and one is called a secondary decomposer. All three of these mushrooms, white button, cremini, and portobello, are actually the same species of mushrooms. They're slightly different strains. So there's like a whiter version and the darker version. And the darker version is cremini, and if you let it grow up, it becomes a portobello. The white button mushrooms, I don't know why they don't let any of them grow up. If they did, they would become like portobellos, but white. For some reason, they don't do that. But the secondary decomposer thing is a problem, because what it means is that you can't just have them eat straw or wood or commonly found materials. You have to compost it first. So these mushrooms are grown on compost. It's a much more complicated process to consistently come out with this compost and have it be good. And so it's not worth it. It would be very difficult for you to grow these kinds of mushrooms in such a way that they're actually cheaper than the grocery store. It's much more these kinds, just go buy them. And then focus on the other ones, because the other ones taste better anyway. And we'll get into that in a little bit. You'll never save money doing this. If you really are stuck on this idea of growing white buttons, it is definitely possible. But I would suggest there's actually related species to these. So these are all Agaricus bisporus. There are other Agaricus species, such as Agaricus blazei and Agaricus subrufescens, that supposedly taste much better than these, and it's the same process to grow them. So if you're going to get into them, don't stick with the ones from the grocery store. Branch out, once you've figured out how to make the compost or whatever, branch out into these other species. They're supposedly much tastier, and why they're not commercially available, I'm not sure. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the fungi life cycle. So whereas with plants, they grow fruits, you get seeds out of the fruits, you plant the seeds, you get another plant, right? With fungi, we'll start at the top here, even though it's obviously a cycle. So at the top here, the mushroom is the fruit. It's the spore producing body. It's the thing that cranks out the spores. The spores, in nature, go out and they find a little spot, and if the conditions are favorable, they germinate sort of like seeds, except that each spore is what's called a monokaryote. And so they actually need two spores to germinate near each other and touch. And that is what becomes the dikaryote. That's what can potentially produce another fruiting body. So as those things come out and they germinate and they touch, what they're touching is called hyphae. And these are tiny little, invisible to the naked eye, tiny, tiny, tiny little filaments, very, very thin. And when they meet and they start coalescing with each other and they start intertwining with each other, the fabric that they form is called mycelium. Mycelium is what I think of as the organism. You can kind of call any of these stages the organism, but mycelium is really when you can see it. It's visible to the naked eye. You can take a big block of sawdust and put this, put some hyphae in there, and it will colonize it and turn it white. What you're seeing there is mycelium. So mycelium is really the core organism that we're talking about. And then as mycelium gets denser and denser and denser and decides it wants to fruit, and we'll talk about when it wants to fruit a little bit later on, but when it decides to start to fruit, what happens is that it forms what's called a hyphal knot, which is the very beginning of a mushroom where it just starts to get a little bit more dense there. When it grows, it becomes a primordia or a pin. We call that pinning. And you'll see these early primordia on things, and then that would then turn into a mushroom. And the mushroom here is pictured as just a standard mushroom with gills, but we have all kinds of different mushrooms. We have ones with pores, we have ones with gills, we have ones that come out with clusters, we have ones that come out individually. So that is the basic process for mushrooms in the wild. Now, as growers, the problem with this process is that spores, you wind up, it's sort of like getting seeds out of an F1 hybrid. I think that's the correct terminology in gardening. So if you get seeds where two plants were crossed in order to make a specific seed, and then that seed you plant, you grow the plant, and then you take that plant seeds will not be true to their parent. And the same is true with spores. So with spores, what you're getting is basically a genetic crapshoot. Sometimes it's better, sometimes the next one will be stronger, faster, grow more mushrooms off of the same amount of substrate. Sometimes that's great. And that's how we've come up with all of these different strains and species that people are cultivating, is by finding these in the woods. And then a lot of times they get genetically selected for certain characteristics. That is all fine. You guys don't need to know anything about that at all. Working with spores is difficult. It requires using petri dishes and agar in order to create hybrids. It's a whole can of worms. You guys don't ever need to worry about that at all unless you really get deep into the hobby. So what we do is we hijack the cycle. So we take a mushroom, and instead of letting it spore, it will spore, but instead of letting it spore and using those sort of to make the next generation, what we do is we clone mushrooms. And so you can take a full-grown mushroom. Actually, you can do this from the grocery store too, if you wanted to. You can get like oyster mushrooms from the grocery store and take a little piece of it and put it on wet cardboard, and it will start to grow out on the cardboard. The mycelium will start to grow again, even though you've taken it from a fruiting body, from a mushroom. So once you have that fruiting body clone on a petri dish, on agar, on a petri dish, then you can propagate that indefinitely. Basically, you can just take those dishes and keep taking little tiny chunks and putting them on other dishes and keep that culture going indefinitely. So the word I'm using there is culture. And think of that as your starting point, is the culture. So that would be living mycelium either on a petri dish or in something called liquid culture, which is basically just a suspension. It's a nutrient-rich liquid. And this is the real starting point for home growers, because then you're getting a clone. Then you're getting, it's sort of like, if you clone a plant, you get exactly the same as the mother plant. Eventually you might run into problems cloning over and over and over again. And the same is true with mushrooms. It's called senescence, where this culture sort of gets old. But in the meantime, you can basically indefinitely, and if you switch substrates, if you switch the materials that this mycelium is growing on, you can keep this going for a really, really, really long time. It's very difficult. Most mushrooms don't have a problem of senescence as long as you change their food source every once in a while. So, so we start with the mushroom. We clone it to agar. We make liquid culture or use agar directly to grain spawn. I'll explain these terms in a minute. And then that makes the hyphae, and we put it into what's called a substrate, which is just the material it's going to grow on. And from there, that's how we keep going without ever worrying about the spores, and knowing for sure that the next generation of our mushrooms is going to come out the same way as our first generation did, not some total random, sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse. We can keep going with the same one over and over again. So that's it for the general fungi life cycle. Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question if you'd like on the first part of this course, or type into the chat. I love questions. Please ask questions. Awesome. Okay. Well, at least you guys can hear me. That's good to know. Excellent. So, part one, mushrooms are not plants. Part two, okay, mushrooms aren't plants. How do we grow them? So here's the basic pieces of the puzzle. The first part is culture, and we talked a little bit about culture. That is your living mycelium, and it's on something, and we mail these things around to each other. So there's a place called the Mycelium Emporium, sorry, the Mycelium Emporium, and I'll give you a list of links to good places later on down the road, where you can buy cultures, and they're called liquid cultures. They come in syringes, and it is literally just living mycelium suspended in essentially a sugar solution so that it's still alive. And you can mail these things around. So there's no problem sending these cultures around. You can also, certain people will sell you a plate, and then certain people will sell you something called a master culture slant, depending on how much you want to pay, depending on whether you want to produce commercially, all kinds of different things. But in general, for most of the mushrooms we're talking about, you can start from liquid culture. You guys don't have to do that. So don't worry about that as much. I'm just explaining the process right now. When we get into the next step, which is spawn, I'll give you a little bit more detail on where you guys can jump in. So there's the culture, there's the spawn. Spawn is what you grow it out on next. So you take this syringe and you inject it into a sterilized jar of hydrated grain. Which could be wheat, it can be oats, it can be all kinds of different grains. I've seen people use rye grass seed. I've seen people use popcorn. You can use a lot of different things to make spawn. And then from there, you take that spawn and you dump it into what's called substrate. And most of the time, oh, I have a better slide on this. Here, let's jump forward one slide. So we went over culture, we went over spawn. The substrate is what is actually going to fruit from. So your substrate could be a log, it could be straw, it could be, in the case of like white button mushrooms, it's compost. And I'll show you a couple of different techniques for how to make totems, how to make logs. There's something called HWFP that gets thrown around a lot. It's hardwood fuel pellets. So the little pellets that you can buy a big bag of at Lowe's or Home Depot that you use for a hardwood fuel pellet or a pellet stove, those are basically just little pellets of compressed sawdust. And if you can get good ones that are hardwood, you don't want pine, you don't want cedar, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But if you can get good ones, then when you add water to them, they basically turn into sawdust. So it's like buying sawdust. So when you think of, when people say HWFP or hardwood fuel pellets, it's just compressed sawdust. And then the other thing that gets thrown around a lot, and you'll start to see this on the forums, is something called master's mix. So when we have hardwood fuel pellets, if we just use them by themselves, a lot of times there's not enough nutrition for the mushrooms to really dig in and thrive. They can grow in it and they'll produce, but they don't produce as much. So we supplement the hardwood fuel pellets, and that's called supplemented sawdust bags. We make these bags that is sawdust, hardwood fuel pellets, mixed with some kind of nutritional thing. It could be wheat bran, it could be oat bran. There's a bunch of different kinds of supplements you can use. Alfalfa pellets. Different kinds of supplements. There's a bunch of different techniques for doing this. One really popular one that produces really, really well is called Master's Mix. And it's a 50-50 mix of hardwood fuel pellets and soybean hulls. We don't know why it does so well. It does really well. So you will see that term thrown around a lot. And then, so we've talked about culture, we've talked about spawn, we've talked about substrate. Fruiting is the final piece of the puzzle. The picture I have here is something called a Martha fruiting chamber. So this is the chamber that I built, actually. It has controlled temperature. It's got controlled humidity. It's all automated so that the foggers turn on at the right time when the humidity drops too low. It's the kind of thing that I build because I like building things and I'm really into this hobby. You guys don't need one of these. If you want to get to that point, you're more than welcome to, but I'm going to show you a bunch of techniques that are more catered towards the gardening aspect. Like, how do we do this outside? How do we do this with our beds? How do we interplant? oyster mushrooms or something with our plants in order to make both of them better. Because I feel like that's what I would want coming from the gardening side. If you guys want me to go more into this, I'm more than happy to. I know a ton about it. I built this thing. But in the meantime, I'm just going to assume that everybody's sort of on the same page, that what we're going for is more of gardening techniques. One thing I didn't talk about with spawn is the different kinds of spawn. And there's three big ones, right? So spawn, the difference between spawn and substrate is basically that substrate is what you're going to use to actually create the fruits. And spawn is the stuff you're going to use in order to inoculate the substrate. The line gets blurry. You can fruit directly from spawn if you want to, but it's not as good as taking the spawn to substrate. So it's a blurry line, but the important piece to know is that there's basically three kinds of spawn. One is called grain spawn. That's the one I was talking about earlier, where you have any kind of grain, really. There's a bunch of different techniques for how to get it properly hydrated, how to get it properly sterilized. But you start with sterile grain, and you inject some living mycelium into it, and it takes over the grain. That's the first kind. That's the one that's pictured here. And I think this is rye with oyster mushroom mycelium growing on it. In this, actually, the picture looks like it's been recently shaken up. A lot of times it'll get much, much denser than that. Sawdust spawn is when you take grain spawn and you put it into hardwood fuel pellets without any supplementation. The sawdust spawn is good for certain applications where if you just dumped grain, the raccoons and the mice and the bugs would all just eat the grain, and you wouldn't have enough mycelium left to really take over an area. So sawdust spawn is sort of the next layer up, where you have the grain in there, but if everything comes and eats all of your grain, it doesn't matter because it's already taken hold of this sawdust, and really nothing wants to eat sawdust in nature except for mycelium. So you don't have the bugs coming to try to eat all the sawdust, even if it's got mycelium in there. The third one you can do is plug spawn, and you make this the same way you do with sawdust spawn, where you dump grain spawn into plugs. They're just little dowels or little, I forget what they call them in woodworking, but it's just little tiny chunks of wood that are round that you can use to drill holes in a log and then tap with a hammer. You can hammer in these dowels to inoculate a log. And that's one of the methods that we'll talk about in a little bit. So those are the three important ones. What's critical here is you'll notice that I only talk about spores once on here. And technically you can get spores as a culture, but you probably shouldn't. Unless you have some specific reason why you need spores, it's almost always a bad route to take. The other thing that I haven't talked about on here at all is seeds. So if anybody online is trying to sell you mushroom seeds, it's a scam. 100% of the time, it's a scam. There's a lot of scammers out there that will try to sell you morel seeds. Morels are one of the ones we talked about earlier that are mycorrhizal, and so they can't grow without a relationship with trees. So whatever morel seeds you're getting, a lot of times it's just grain spawn, but you still can't do anything with it. It doesn't help to have grain spawn of morels because you can't grow morels. There's not a coherent, consistent way of doing that. Somebody may figure out eventually how to do it. Right now, we're not there. So be very wary of anybody trying to sell you mushroom seeds. They're almost certainly trying to take advantage of you because you don't know enough about mushrooms yet. So that's what this class is going to try to teach you. All right. Any questions? Feel free to ask. Feel free to unmute and ask anything at any point. Otherwise, I'm just going to continue talking into my blank screen here. I have a couple notes here that are fun. One is that as this process happens, as you go from spawn to substrate to fruiting, different mushrooms have different aggressiveness during that process. And so whereas with an oyster mushroom, oysters are a great beginner species, and they are very fast and they're very hardy. It's hard to kill off an oyster mushroom. It can be done, but it's difficult. They're very hardy. They take over substrate really quickly. A week, 2 weeks max, I would say. And they've taken over, depending on your grain spawn ratios, and there's a couple other factors, temperature, stuff like that. So we're talking about a couple weeks here. Others take much longer. So shiitake, for example, is a minimum of 75, 80 days from the time you dump the grain spawn into the bag till the bag is ready to fruit. Maitake, I've heard, I haven't grown maitake myself, but I've heard maitake is an even longer process than shiitake. So one of the things that matters there is that as you're thinking through these things, and a lot of the outdoor ones won't matter, but if you get into the hobby, they're trying to plan to have a consistent amount of mushrooms per week is difficult because of this incubation timing, because of how long it takes certain mushrooms versus other mushrooms, and trying to plan all that stuff out. The other thing to notice is that I haven't really talked about, I mean, from spawn to substrate, I've talked about how grain spawn, you sort of just dump it in. Plug spawn, you drill a hole, you hammer it in. Sawdust spawn, you can spread it out over stuff. But I haven't talked about the transition from substrate to fruiting. Most mushrooms that I will talk about in this class have relatively easy, basically once they're colonized in that substrate, they will just start fruiting on their own. Certain mushrooms have what we call pinning triggers, and these pinning triggers can be very weird. They can be, so for example, for shiitake, when shiitakes are ready to go, and this can be in a bag or this can be on a log, you hit them really hard with a hammer or a rubber mallet to really shock them, and that triggers pinning. And we think, I don't know that anybody has ever proven this, but we think it's because it's mimicking what would happen in nature, where shiitakes took over a dead standing tree. When that tree falls, the shiitake sort of knows, and I'm anthropomorphizing a little bit, but the shiitake sort of knows that it's about to run out of food and it needs to spread its spores to go somewhere else to take over something else, right? And so this falling motion, and it can be replicated by hitting a hammer or slapping a block, and then they pin. It's the weirdest thing. I've had shiitakes on the shelf ready to go for a long time, and what I do is I take them off the shelf when I'm ready to fruit. I slap them real hard, pop them in the fruiting chamber, and they will fruit the next day. The other thing you can do, and a lot of these will have it, is you can force pinning. And forcing pinning is where normally they would naturally pin during a certain season. So there's a lot of seasonal mushrooms. There's a lot of mushrooms that grow either in the spring or in the fall based on temperature changes. And so you can cold shock some of these things. So if you have shiitake logs, one of the other things, or oyster logs, one of the other things you can do is cold shock them. So with the bags, you can just pop them in the fridge for 8 hours, and they'll think it's the first cold night of the season, and they'll fruit because that's their time to fruit. There's also dunking. So with a log, of what they really need, so mushrooms are 90% water, 10% other material, mycelium and hyphae and stuff like that. So the 90% of them that's water means they need a lot of water to grow. And that comes from the humidity in the environment. So we're going to try to maintain high humidity environments, but it also can come from the material, the source material. So you can take a log of oyster mushrooms and dunk it in a lot of people use kiddie pools actually. Dunk it in a kiddie pool, submerge it for 8 to 24 hours, and then pull them out. And then that has a very high tendency to trigger fruiting. It's like they got a good rain out in nature. And so, yeah, you can trigger some stuff like that. So there's a little bit of control that you have over these fruiting triggers. What else do I have here? Okay, so let's talk about the overall process, right? So I've sort of walked you through these four. I created this for a much more detailed class where I was really talking about all of the different ways of doing things, how to clean up stuff on agar, how to make liquid culture, how to inoculate this whole, so basically all these sterile processes. Okay, I have a question here. Do the chemicals in our water make a difference in the dunking, tap water versus rainwater? So that's a great question, actually. In one of the forums there was a really long debate about using tap water versus using bottled water, reverse osmosis bottled water. The consensus generally from the big time growers who actually really know what they're doing is that tap water is totally fine. There's no problem with tap water. The chlorine doesn't have any effect. The fluoride doesn't have any effect. Potentially there are some minor effects, but the guys who do this professionally, who have tried both, say it's not worth the expense of going out of your way to try to get a cleaner source of water or rainwater. Yeah, so hopefully that answers that question. I just use tap water for everything, and the tap water out here is there's a lot of minerals in it, so I have to clean my fruiting chamber much more often than I would if I was using cleaner water, but otherwise there's no substantial difference. So all right, so back to this. So we've got these sort of big pieces here. So we've got the sterile processes, and the reason that those processes are sterile, I'll just touch on briefly, is that what you want to do there is give the mycelium a really, really good head start, because everything wants to eat the stuff that's in the sterile box. So agar in a petri dish, bacteria want to eat it, yeast want to eat it, mushrooms want to eat it, everything wants to eat this stuff. Grain, if you have properly hydrated grain and you sit it out on the counter for overnight, in the morning it will be moldy. Everything wants to eat grain. Once you get down where the mycelium has already consolidated, it's already like taken over the grain, it can fend off, it's got its own immune system, so it can fend off attackers that are trying to get to that grain, and it can kind of hold on to it. So once we get to that point, then we can go out and have non-sterile conditions, because the other stuff, the plugs, the wooden dowels, the sawdust, the straw, very little stuff in nature wants to eat those things. It's hard for anything other than mushrooms to digest cellulose and lignin are the main components of these other materials. So we go from, in the beginning, having to be super sterile about everything. I've got a big pressure cooker that I use to pressure cook my substrate and grain and stuff like that. And then we go out to either the indoor fruiting options or the outdoor fruiting options, both of which can be non-sterile. It's helpful to pasteurize. So we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about straw. Yeah, so what we're going to focus in on here is the pieces that you can buy commercially, because this whole first sterile process box is complicated. It requires equipment. It requires a lot of technique and a lot of knowledge really behind the scenes. But fortunately, other people have that knowledge and we can buy stuff from them. So I will, at the end of this, share a list of places where you can buy grain spawn, you can buy plug spawn, and you can buy sawdust spawn. And then this supplemented sawdust bags we touched on a little bit earlier, but you can buy, they call them ready to fruit bags. So basically it's already colonized. They send you the whole bag. That's a really good starter option for growing mushrooms. So yeah, so that's actually how I got into the hobby, was starting by buying these ready to fruit kits. And then I've got my whole automated mushroom fruiting humidity chamber thing. You guys don't need that. All you need for one of these blocks is a plastic grocery bag, and you stab the block with a couple of bamboo skewers so that it raises the grocery bag off of the block. And it's a really, really easy way to, and then every once in a while you spritz the inside of the bag with water. It's a really easy way to maintain enough humidity and enough air exchange that the mushrooms will be happy and they will grow on your kitchen countertop. You can grow oysters this way. You can grow chestnuts. You can grow all kinds of different species this way. And it's a great starting point. So that's an indoor fruiting option if you just want to get your feet wet and you just want to see what this hobby is all about and watch that very cool moment where all of a sudden you go from these tiny little pins to huge mushrooms pretty much overnight. It's pretty much like a one to 2 day process to go from tiny little pins coming out of the side of these bags all the way up to the substantial mushrooms that you can harvest and eat. So I highly recommend that as an option if you just want to dunk your toes into the field. These ready to fruit bags are awesome. They're easy to grow. They cost about $20. And then you get anywhere from 2 to 5 pounds of mushrooms out of them, which is a pretty good trade-off, I'd say, for watching the thing grow and having it be awesome. After you do that a couple times, you start to think, maybe I can make my own supplemented sawdust bags for cheaper. And it's way cheaper to make your own. So it requires a pressure cooker, it requires some equipment. But what you can do instead is go up one level, and that is buying grain spawn. So for $25 or so plus shipping, you can get a big bag of grain spawn where all of the sterile stuff has already been done for you. And you can take that grain spawn, you can make your own plug spawn with it by dumping some of it into pasteurized plugs. You can make your own sawdust spawn with it by dumping it into, actually you should probably do, if you're doing supplemented, you should do sterilized there as well. So, but if you're willing to dump, you know, $70 on a 23 quart Presto pressure cooker, you can really jump up a level and make these things yourself for much, much cheaper. So just an option if you want to go in that direction. But the other thing you can do is you can buy grain spawn, plug spawn, and sawdust spawn, and just inoculate substrate out in your garden. You can see in the outdoor fruiting options, I have logs, I have totems, which are really just logs, but they're bigger. Straw logs, beds, baskets. There's a bunch of different things you can do on that front, just starting from grain spawn or plug spawn or sawdust spawn. When you do straw, when you do straw, you want to pasteurize it and chop it up. And I think I have a slide on that later. So we'll just jump right in here first. So first, I want to show you 3 different ways of doing outdoor beds. So the first one, or I'm sorry, outdoor grows. So the first one here is a wine cap bed. And I'll give you a species list later that says which species are good for which type of growing. But I just wanted to show you some images so you would get a sense of what I'm talking about here when I'm saying beds. This is literally just a bunch of wood chips, leaf litter, stuff you would find on the forest floor, mixed in with sawdust spawn. So you buy a bag of sawdust spawn, and there's a handful of really good species for it. Shiitakes are good. Wine caps, which is in this picture, are very good. Oysters work well. And you can do this with hardwood fuel pellets. You could do it with sawdust. You can do it with wood chips. You can do it with straw. And you make these beds, and then they will keep producing as long as there's stuff for them to eat. So they would produce year after year after year. And if you make a bed in the spring, especially in DC, Wyoming has a very short spring season, but in DC, where you guys are, if you make a bed in the spring, you can generally expect mushrooms by the fall. So it's kind of a cool option. It will keep going year after year. You can keep adding more leaf litter to it, especially with wine cap beds. They love it when you just keep throwing leaf litter on top, and they'll just keep consuming it and keep popping out mushrooms. It's a very cool sort of garden-y kind of way to get started. You can also do this in between your rows of other plants. These fungi do not hurt plants at all. If anything, they make resources more available to plants by breaking down stuff. So you can run this in between rows of plants where you can have shiitakes or oysters popping up. When I talk about leaf litter, do you mean dried, ground, cut up leaves, or just fallen leaves? Both, either. The more cut up it is, the smaller the pieces are, the faster the mycelium will eat it and consolidate it. But it can do either. I've seen people just take literally the pile of leaves that they rake up in the fall, put it in like a cage, and then add sawdust spawn to it, and it will take over that pile eventually. So when you're talking about cutting stuff up, it's just a matter of speed, especially in the outdoors. I would recommend, if you're going to do straw, to chop the straw up finer. Mycelium has a little bit of a hard time just with the shape of the straw. It has a hard time getting into the middle, and so sometimes molds can form. So I would chop up straw. The way that I do that, and I have done that in the past, is with a plastic, that's a good question, plastic trash can, big Rubbermaid trash can, big piece of cardboard with a hole in the middle of it that I put around my weed whacker, and literally just weed whack the straw in the plastic trash can for a while. It's there are also, for the guys who do this professionally, there are straw chopping machines you can buy, or you can run them through like a wood chipper to break them up a little bit. So I will say it's a messy process. I don't really like working with straw for that very reason, because you'll find, 3 days later, you'll find straw that's been in your ear the whole time. It gets everywhere. So for me, I would just use leaf litter, wood chips, that kind of stuff. But it does take them a little bit longer to grab a hold of that stuff. But as long as you're using sawdust spawn, it'll happen eventually. And that's one of the great things about mushrooms, is that when you're growing them indoors, it's mostly because you want a really consistent product week to week. You want, if you want to sell to restaurants, or if you want to sell to direct to consumers or something, you want to have, you want to sell at a farmer's market, you need a really consistent product week after week after week, and you want to control all of those conditions. Outdoors, they just do their own thing. And if you got them and you set them up, it's like a set it and forget it. It's like the Showtime rotisserie, right? You can just set these logs up and then let them run. You can set up a bed and let it run. And there's a couple of different conditions you want to try to maintain. You don't want to do it in a really dry, sunny place. You want them to be tucked in and a little bit more moist and a little bit more humidity around. In places where it is super dry, sometimes people will take burlap sacks and wet them down and place them over the logs. Or you can cover logs as they're inoculating, as they're sort of taking over the logs. You can cover them with a tarp to try to keep the humidity levels up. But it's cool because you kind of just get random product. It just happens. It's the same as gardening, where you expect that you're going to get jalapenos because you planted jalapenos. You don't know exactly when they're coming. You don't know how many you're going to get in any given week. And that's the beauty of outdoor log growing and outdoor growing. So that's the first one is the beds. The second picture here is the logs. And what's happened here is that somebody drilled a bunch of holes in a log and bought plug spawn and plugged the holes. And then you cover them with wax afterwards, because they have a tendency to dry out where those holes are. And they have a tendency, sometimes bugs get in there and stuff. You don't want that. When you're doing logs, you want to try to get winter cut logs if you can, because you want it's really important that the bark stay on the log. If the bark falls off the log, which happens when you cut in the spring, because the layer of living material is swollen with water, and so when it dries out, that layer contracts, and then the bark has a tendency to fall off. Winter cut logs. This is just logs that are cut in the fall. What else? What method and species is most efficient, productive for your time, money, labor, would you say? Yeah, so method and species is almost certainly oyster mushrooms. Oyster mushrooms are really fast. They're really tenacious. They go after stuff. I would say, in terms of trying to reduce labor costs, oysters on straw outdoors, you can make a giant like laundry basket full of straw with some oyster mycelium and just let it run and randomly get mushroom flushes all the time for quite some time. Have I ever broken down how much homegrowing costs you per pound of mushroom? I will say that without factoring in my time and overhead, for a 5-pound block of mushroom mycelium, it cost me about $1.50. And I would expect out of that 5-pound block, depending on the biological efficiency of the mushroom itself, I would expect about 5 pounds. No, I'm sorry, about 2.5 to 3.5 pounds of mushrooms off of that. So for $1.50, 3 pounds of mushrooms is way more than you would get at a grocery store. So that's even well in line under wholesale prices. Now that doesn't factor into my time, which is it's probably more expensive. And if you go commercial and hire people to do this stuff, it's a whole different calculation. But for me, 3 pounds of mushrooms for $1.50 plus some of my time, and I like doing this stuff, not so bad, right? And I think my whole setup here with my pressure cooker and all the materials I need for my lab and the Petri dishes and all said and done, I think I spent like $1,100 total. So yeah, and that's lasted me for a year and a half worth of growing, no problem. So yeah, when I say flush, yes, it's like a crop. So a flush is when the mushrooms all come out like they are here. So these logs will sit for a long period of time, and then one day everything will start growing, and that's a flush. So these guys are in flush right now. We call that a flush. It's like a crop. It's like coming in, but this can happen multiple times per year with certain species. Sometimes some species are only once a year. Some species, like I know in Japan, they really, really like the September shiitakes. There's something about the month of September in Japan that makes them crack on the top in a very certain way, and the flavor profile changes, and they love them. But you can also force fruit them in the spring. So that's one sort of option here. I bet my wife took these photos. My wife took a lot of these photos, yes. Kits are fun and easy. City doesn't have outdoor growing options except where they make it stolen. Next level DIY option in between doing it all from scratch and the ready to go kit. Yeah, the next level DIY option would be to buy grain spawn and make your own blocks. And so grain spawn is much less expensive because you can expand it out. So you can take a bag of grain spawn and then use that to inoculate more grain. And then that grain you can use to make blocks out of it. And so those blocks are the ones that I talked about. You know, the materials for a block cost about $1.50. The grain spawn costs maybe $25, but you can turn that grain spawn, that couple pounds of grain spawn, you can turn 2 pounds of grain spawn into 200 pounds of grain spawn if you wanted to. So if you get a pressure cooker, then it opens up a lot of those options that are the cheaper end of the home growing scale. And then eventually you would want something like what I have, which is this Martha fruiting chamber, just for the consistency of the flushes. You know, if you've got a bunch of different bags going on your kitchen countertop, you can do that, but watering them all by hand takes a long time. And so automating a lot of those processes, it's not that expensive to do. They have a lot of different humidity controllers and stuff that are not that expensive, but that would be the next level, would be to buy your own grain spawn and then expand it out and make your own kits, basically. All right, thanks for the questions. I appreciate it. It's awesome. You can also, except when they might get stolen. Yeah, that's a tough one. But I mean, the buckets or the, here, I can show you a couple of, so this is bucket technique. You can do it on straw bales. You can do it in this laundry basket style. These guys, I could see have the potential to get stolen. If you did it in beds, in your community garden plot, for example, if you have rows of tomatoes and peppers, and then in the soil in between, you add some straw, you add some mulch, you can get flushes of oyster mushrooms. You can get flushes of stuff that's not in a place that are where somebody can walk away with them, right? Types of mushrooms in the picture. So the first one on the far left is called a wine cap, W-I-N-E cap. Yeah, wine taps, and then shiitake in the middle, and then oyster on the, yeah, excellent, April, appreciate that. This last picture I didn't really talk about is totems. So the way you make totems, really, really easy. This is for much bigger logs. So you want for log techniques, for this log growing, you want logs basically in the 4 to 7 inch range is pretty good. If you get bigger than that, they have a hard time getting all the way down into the middle, and your flushes are inconsistent. So it's possible to do the same thing with bigger logs. They say in general, you get about a year of fruiting out of a log for every inch of diameter. So a 6-inch diameter log will give you 6 years of fruiting. So it's a pretty good investment up front to get one of these logs and have it just cranking, you know, off in a dark corner where you're not going to grow any good plants anyway. And just have it cranking along, checking it in on every once in a while, watering it every once in a while. Maybe, you know, if it gets super dry or something, throw a little tent or something on it. These totems are even thicker, right? So the totems are for big sort of stump style grows. There's a great video by Eric Myers. Eric Myers of Myers Mushrooms is one of my heroes. He has an amazing operation, really, really sharp guy. He's got a bunch of YouTube videos, a bunch of Vimeo videos, and he's kind of an engineering type guy, kind of a do-it-yourself kind of guy. So I really like his videos. But he shows how to make totems, and it's basically you cut the log where the bottom half of it, or the bottom, you cut maybe a 4-inch strip off the top, and then you do it 8 inches and then another 8 inches. And you put in between those cracks, you put sawdust spawn. If you put grain spawn, raccoons will knock it over and steal your grain spawn. So you put sawdust spawn in there, and you can see in this third picture how the oysters are fruiting out of the cracks, basically. But it will take over that entire totem over time, and you just get tons of flushes. I've seen people plug dead standing trees that are in their yard, where you can get huge flushes out of stuff over time. It's just, it's not quite as consistent. It's not quite as fast, but if you've got the patience and you're willing to and you're willing to do the upfront investment, over time, you just keep getting more and more and more of these mushrooms. So I think, you know, if I was going to set something up in my mom's backyard where she could just go out and harvest mushrooms every once in a while, I would probably do a totem. They last a really long time. They're easy enough to make. Yeah. Let's see. Can you overwater the logs? Not to my knowledge. No, I don't think. The only time you could potentially overwater the logs is when you have mushrooms on them. For example, lion's mane does not like to be sprayed directly. The fruits kind of come out weird if you spray lion's mane directly with water. So, but while they're just sitting there, you can dunk them in a kiddie pool for 8, 12 hours, completely saturate the whole thing. And if anything, that's good for the log. So I would say no in general, except if they're actual fruits on them. You don't want to spray the fruits directly all the time. I remember you said mushrooms like oak. Are there other logs they like, don't like? Yes, absolutely. Everything loves oak. That's oak is, you know, in the DC area, I would just be trying to find oak. Everything loves oak. You can do almost any hardwood. So there are certain mushrooms that like certain kind of trees, woodier mushrooms like box elders for some reason. I have no idea why. So certain mushrooms like certain kind of trees. I can add, actually, I have a chart that's the species and then the wood types that they like and don't like. There are certain specialty ones, like Phoenix oysters are very good on pine. Most other mushrooms aren't great on pine. They don't like pine. Pine has extra chemicals in it that are a sort of antifungal. Almost nothing like cedar. Cedar is like the most antifungal properties you could get in a log is cedar. And so avoid cedar like the plague in mushroom hunting. But if you want to build outdoor furniture, cedar's great because nothing can digest it. So yeah, kind of a coin toss there. Is shade better than partial sun, or is it simply a matter of keeping the humidity high? Shade is fine. Partial sun is fine. Mushrooms like a little bit of light during their growth cycle, but they don't like being beaten on. They really like that high humidity environment, and they like, you know, they'll dry out really easily. In fact, a lot of times in the woods, you'll see mushrooms that flushed and then dried out completely. They're still edible, but they're not as good as if you had the high humidity the whole time and got them fresh. For totems, yeah, for totems, it's if you can get them more in the shade so that the water doesn't evaporate as quickly, that's better. But if the only place you have is partial sun, that's going to be fine. If you have places where it's really intense sunlight, it's just going to be too dry. It's going to be sort of the same problem as plants that don't like intense sunlight. It's mostly a water thing. It's not necessarily, you know, I don't know that mushrooms necessarily get sunburned the way that a plant can, but they don't like high intensity heat. They don't like high intensity sunlight shining directly on them. So great question. If you could also, you know, they're not photosynthesizing, so they don't need light per se. A little bit of light helps in every stage of their growth. We don't understand all of the mechanisms behind why exactly they like a little bit of light. But you know, you may have heard of people growing white button mushrooms completely in these dark warehouses, or somebody's growing, you know, some illegal mushrooms in their closet or something like that. They do like a little bit of light, but it's not a requirement. So a lot of times what people do, if they're in a place where they have partial sun, they'll cover the logs with a burlap bag while they're inoculating and check back every once in a while. Eventually, if it's oysters, they'll eat the bag too. So it's funny how that works. Oysters are voracious. They will eat almost anything. What else? Okay, so let's talk about logs for one more second here. So when I said drilling, you can see that these mushrooms are popping out of the holes that they drilled and did plug spawn, and that's because there's no bark there. So it's an obvious place for them to want to reach out and try to fruit. When you're drilling 30 to 40 holes in a log with a drill, it gets old fast. Even if you have a really good drill, even if it's a plug-in drill, it gets really old really fast. So if you're going to do this at scale, if you're going to do 10 or 20 of these at a community garden event or something like that, what you really want is an angle grinder. And they have adapter attachments specifically for drilling these holes in using an angle grinder. The other thing you can do is you can get plugs, which are the little dowel things that you can tap in with a hammer and then cover with wax. Or there's a little gizmo that they have where you can take sawdust spawn, so it's just loose sawdust, and you punch it into the spawn, it grabs a little bit of it, and then you would kind of inject it in. So those tools, if you're doing a bunch of logs, or if you decide to get really into it, those are both really important tools to know about, because at scale, using a drill and a hammer is horrible. You don't want to do 20, 30 logs like that. One log, no problem. Two logs, no problem. 30, ooh, get an angle grinder. Rent one from Home Depot and get the attachment or something. What species do well indoors besides oysters? Let's get to that questions right now. Okay, so here's straw. And then let's talk about some species. So just real quick to run through these species. We have oyster mushrooms, wine caps. The one in the middle is lion's mane. You can see some shiitake growing in the bottom corner, and then chestnuts in the other corner, where I am so fabulously excited about chestnut mushrooms, which are delicious and very fun. So here's the species list. Here's the ones that I would look at sort of as beginner species. Some of them are slightly more advanced, but really these are all doable. And these are the ones that you're going to be most likely to find things like plug spawn, sawdust spawn, grain spawn. You could buy these. With some of the other ones, it's you basically have to get the liquid culture and make it yourself. So if you're not at that level yet, that's fine. These guys are all amazing. They're easy to grow. So we have the list where it says hardwood fuel pellets. Those would be all the ones, April, that are good for indoors. These are all very easily accessible. You can see I have a column where some are easier than others, but these are all doable on hardwood fuel pellets indoors. You can also do most of these on straw. I've seen people make big straw logs also for indoor grows, where you take PVC tubing. It's like this plastic, clear plastic. It's not like a PVC pipe, but clear plastic tubing. And then you tie off one end and sort of stuff it in like it's a sausage and poke some holes in it and hang those bags. I've seen people do that in their garage. But you can also take those same bags and hang them and do them in your backyard. You can hang them off a tree. So there's some cool options there. And there's, like I said, the rabbit hole goes deep. There's a million, for every person that's growing mushrooms, they've got free things that they're doing that no one else is doing. So it's a fascinating hobby to get into. The stuff's not super standardized yet. We have a lot of good stuff happening right now in the field. Yeah, things are happening all the time. Tried shiitakes indoors on logs, unsuccessful both times. I'm gonna guess it was a humidity problem more than anything. I would have to see pictures and sort of understand more of your grow setup for shiitakes, but there's no reason why you wouldn't be able to do shiitakes indoors on logs, except that it takes a long time. So like I was saying before, like if I do a bag of shiitakes, it takes 80 days for them to fully colonize and consolidate that substrate. For a log, it could take even longer. It could be, it could be that it's going to take a year of having reasonable conditions before that thing fruits. So I'm not sure. I haven't actually done shiitake logs myself. I've done oyster logs and yeah, basically just oyster logs. So not 100% sure on that, but I can't think of a reason why it wouldn't work except for humidity and soaking the log. Unless the bark fell off. If the bark falls off, it's pretty much a no-go from that point forward. The bark is necessary to keep the humidity level up inside the log itself. So sorry that you were unsuccessful, but it's possible. So yeah, and it may be even easier outside. I don't know, not sure. So yeah, so we've got what else here? We have there's also some medicinal species that you can grow in the same way. So like I've got reishi on here, which is a Ganoderma species, which is a medicinal species. There's a couple of medicinal species like turkey tail that you can grow indoors and you can grow on logs, but it's so easy to find in the woods that it's better to just learn how to identify it in the woods and go find it out in the woods. So I haven't really dug into all of the species list here in terms of medicinal stuff. But you can see there's a wide option here of different ways of doing different things. So for example, lion's mane is a great mushroom, and it's got some medicinal properties. There's like these beta glucan things that are supposed to be good for your neuroregeneration, for your neurons. So we'll see. The science is still out on a lot of this stuff. It's just developing now. But lion's mane you can do on straw. You can do on hardwood fuel pellets. You can do outside on logs. You can do outside on totems. They're not great in beds, but if you're going to do a bed, oysters are great. And there's a bunch of different kinds of oysters. There's golden oysters, there's pink oysters, there's pearl oysters, there's white oysters. So that one line of oysters there actually encompasses a lot of different species and strains. Shiitakes are good on hardwood fuel pellets, logs, totems, and beds. Wine caps work really, really well on beds. I think I should have put straw there also. Although I've never seen anyone grow them in a straw log or like a laundry basket the way you can with oysters. They're mostly for beds, but they will certainly eat straw in the beds. Chestnuts. So if you were hooked on Agaricus bisporus, if you're hooked on the idea of growing something like a white button mushroom that you can substitute for white button mushrooms, chestnuts are my go-to. Chestnuts are they look like that, where I'm pointing at it, and they're very, very cool to watch grow. But they taste sort of like white buttons, but they're a nuttier white button, I would say, and they can be substituted one for one in any recipe. You can use them in spaghetti sauce, you can, saute them, anything you can do with white buttons, you can do with chestnuts. So if you're gonna go this route, and you want something that's in that ballpark, chestnuts would be my recommendation for sure. What else? There he is. I found some wine caps. Yep. So wine caps are all over the place for sure. Son and daughter found lion's mane in the wild, picked out all the beetles and dehydrated some of it, which they gave to me. How would you prepare it to best advantage? Good question. So if it's dehydrated, you definitely want to rehydrate it first before cooking. And then also reserve the liquid. So the liquid is actually a really flavorful liquid when you rehydrate any mushroom. When you rehydrate morels or lion's mane or anything like that. There's lion's mane, which is Hericium arenaceus. And then there's two similar species to lion's mane that are bear's head, which is Hericium corallades, and there is another one that I think they call monkey paw or something that is Hericium americanum. So there's sort of three things that kind of all look like lion's mane, and might be referred to as lion's mane by people who are out foraging in the woods. So the bear's head one, the Hericium corallades, which is a little bit more looks like coral, as opposed to like a big puffball. The puffball kind of ones are lion's mane, Hericium arenaceus. So those ones where it's more coral-like, to me, taste like crab. And I make crab cakes out of them, or I make crab dip out of them. It's a vegetarian option for a crab dip. And you can really substitute it pretty much one for one with crab in almost any crab recipe. And those are the bear's head ones. For the lion's mane, I like them just chopped up and sauteed. A little bit of garlic, a little bit of butter, do them as a side dish. And a lot of times, because so many mushrooms take well to that application, I'll do like a mixed mushroom with shiitakes and lion's mane and chestnuts and throw them all in there in the pan with garlic and butter, and I just eat them. There's a lot of recipes out there for wild foraged mushrooms. I'm sure they're great. I just like the taste of mushrooms. So I just like tasting them with a little bit of butter and a little bit of garlic. That's me. But that bear's head, the Hericium corallades, that one in particular tastes to me so much like crab, and it's got these long filaments on it. You can see a little bit, what happened? Yeah, in that middle picture, you can see the long teeth that are coming off of it. When those things break up, they have the texture of crab also. And so, that would be my recommendation for that one, if it's that one. You can do it with lion's mane as well, but it doesn't quite have the same texture and taste. It's in the ballpark for sure. You can substitute it for seafood, actually, in a lot of recipes to make a vegetarian or vegan option. Good stuff. Excellent. And it just looks cool. I mean, this is like the thing about this hobby is that this stuff is just cool to watch grow. What is this big poofy teeth-toothed white thing, and can I really eat it? And is it delicious? Yes, to all of the above. They're amazing. So much fun to watch. All right. Okay, so that's sort of the gist of the overall presentation. I will have Josh send out to you copies of the slides here, so that you can get this slide. So the resources here. There's a lot of bad information out there. It's unfortunate, but some of it comes from the guys who are growing psychedelic mushrooms in their closets, and that stuff all gets mixed into the gourmet species, even though they have very different characteristics from each other. And so so I wanted to point you guys in directions of places that I know are not going to steer you wrong. Fresh Cap Mushrooms is not going to steer you wrong. They have a big blog. They've got a bunch of videos. Tony is amazing. He knows what he's doing, and he's got demonstrations for all of the different pieces of this. So he's got demonstrations for how to pasteurize your straw, how to chop your straw, how to make bags out of it, how to layer the grain spawn into the bags, walk you through the whole process. Really, really good videos. Myers Mushrooms is Eric Myers. He's the guy I was talking about earlier, kind of the engineering mind, much bigger operation, I think, and is really, I think he's building a second operation now where he's going through like really high level stuff about how to design a space that's going to be a fruiting space and a lab space and a grain spawn production space, and how to install these giant industrial autoclaves. But he started out where I started out. So his early stuff is all about how to do this at home, how to build your own humidifier, how to build these Martha mushroom fruiting chambers, stuff like that. Really sharp guy. I love his stuff. He's also got, there's a website called Kit where you can make recommendations for pieces of gear that you might want. And his Kit page is excellent. He's got really good stuff on there. What the Fungus, big outdoor operation out of Canada. They grow in greenhouses, so they grow seasonally. Instead of completely controlling all of the environmental factors, he grows seasonally. Great guy, knows a ton about mushrooms, and has showed me a bunch of techniques on his videos about how to get a second fruit out of a bag, things like that. Let's Grow Mushrooms is an old school set of videos. I think it's from the early 80s, maybe. Super old school, maybe early 90s. I don't know, somewhere in there. Old school. Some of the stuff is outdated, but it's such a coherent starting place if you want to get into the lab stuff, if you want to get into how to grow stuff out on agar and then figure out where to transfer from to the next plate of agar in order to clean up your culture, all kinds of different stuff he goes into really deeply. Mushroomvideos.com is where you can buy them. Some of them are also available on YouTube, so you can check those out before you dive in too deep. Mossy Creek Mushrooms, this guy Andrew at Mossy Creek Mushrooms is an excellent guy, has a bunch of great videos too, has sort of a medium-sized operation, and we'll go into things where you're like, what's your cleaning routine? How do you clean this stuff? He goes into that in a lot of depth. So this is sort of an order of like what you might find most relevant down to what you might find sort of, a little bit less relevant if you're not doing an operation where you're trying to grow mushrooms. Vendors, I forgot to enter after the Mycelium Emporium. Those are two separate things. So the Mycelium Emporium, North Spore, Mike Tyson, Cap and Stem, Forest Origins. I tried to grab companies that I knew were reputable around the DC metro area, or at least on the East Coast. There's some guys out in the West Coast that are awesome too. They're not represented here because we want to keep shipping costs down for things like, if you're sending a 5-pound bag of something to somebody, it's not cheap to ship. So if it's coming out of North Spore, or if it's coming out of Maine, or I forget exactly where Mike Tyson is, or if it's coming out of Forest Origins and 10 Mile Mushrooms, I think are in Pennsylvania. So these guys are excellent for buying grain spawn, for buying cultures, for buying plug spawn. Check these websites out. There's one more that I didn't put on here on purpose that you may hear about every once in a while. There's this guy, Paul Stamets, super famous mushroom guy. He's gone on the Joe Rogan Experience to talk about mushrooms. Good guy, good scientist, doing good work. A little overhyped in my book, and with that comes extra price. All of his stuff is way more expensive. So reputable, good guy, but way more expensive than you're going to deal with these sort of mid-tier people, because they're not famous, right? So let's go with the not famous people so that we're not spending money needlessly, even though Paul Stamets, good guy, right? And then forums. So where I learned all this stuff was from basically these videos and these forums. And these forums are excellent. So the mushroom growing and mushroom growers Facebook groups are phenomenal. You can get a ton of help there. This is where was it April earlier was asking what happened with her shiitake logs indoors, right? So if you take a picture of those and say what you did and upload it to these forums and ask what's going wrong, they will figure it out for you. They will walk you through it. And, you know, I'm on there a lot. I help people. So hop on the forums. They're really, really good. And it's especially good to kind of read through what other people's problems are before you jump into the deep end, and research when have other people said, oh, there's something wrong with my wine cap bed. What's going wrong here? And sort of find the answers so that you don't make the same mistakes that other people have already made. These are really good searchable places for that. Shroomery is another one. Shroomery is the line between gourmet mushroom growing and illegal psilocybin cultivation, which isn't illegal everywhere anymore. Denver, I think, and San Francisco, I think, have decriminalized it. But in the meantime, while it's illegal, this place has a lot of information. It covers both gourmet stuff and the active species, the psychedelic species. So it gets very confusing between the two. But there is really good information on there if you know how to search and you know how to go on there. There's also a Shroomery Facebook group that's very helpful if you want to get into that side of things. Last but not least, some common questions that I've seen pop up on these forums a lot that I just wanted to go through to try to dispel some myths right off the bat. One is that for some reason, beginners everywhere have heard that you can grow oyster mushrooms on coffee grounds and want to use the free coffee grounds from Starbucks or wherever to be able to grow oyster mushrooms. Is it doable? Yes. Oyster mushrooms will eat coffee grounds. It's a horrible idea to start with. They're really, really finicky. They're incredibly prone to contamination. If I see coffee in anybody's, grow and there's contamination, it's almost certainly from the coffee. So try to avoid it up front. If you want to play with it later on down the road, that's fine, but try to be successful up front to get mushrooms using trusted techniques before you start dabbling in, oh, well, I have this extra material. Maybe I can grow an oysters on this. You might be able to, but if the techniques aren't there and it's not solid, you'll find that you'll just have really high rates of contamination and then have to throw out a lot of stuff. It's not worth your time. It's better to be successful using proven techniques first, and then later on down the line, play with it. Chicken of the woods, we touched on a little bit. For some reason, no one's figured this out yet. It could be you. You could make millions. Go for it. Try it out. But no, up front, it's very difficult to do. People will sell you chicken in the woods plug spawn. I have not seen good pictures of the end result of any of those. I've never seen someone who's like, oh, here's my chicken in the woods log and have it been growing like those shiitakes. It's just not, I haven't seen it. So could be out there, could be people doing it. There's no reason why it shouldn't be possible, but not great, right? What kind of wood should I grow on? We touched on this a little bit. Pine is iffy, but Phoenix oyster likes pine. I think tarragon oyster, there's a tarragon oyster that might also like pine. I can't remember right now. But there are species lists where you can find, if you search for what type of wood will these mushrooms grow on, or which types of mushrooms are good for which types of wood. And I'll, if I remember, I'll add a slide on that. Because I've got a couple images that are just tables of here's all the mushrooms, here's the woods they like, here's the ones that are preferred, here's the ones that don't like it as much. But generally speaking, if it's a hardwood, you can grow mushrooms on it. You might not get quite the productivity as you would out of an oak. And if you have oak is definitely my go-to. That should be what you're using if you have access to it. And most people in DC, I imagine, would. And stay away from cedar. And otherwise, it's, somewhere in the middle. It'll eat stuff. You'll get flushes. It just might not be quite as productive, or it might not produce for as many years. If you get a really soft hardwood, the mycelium might just eat it really fast, which could be good, could be bad. I don't know. Your call. Why do we need to be sterile? I've heard this question a million times. in nature, nothing is sterile. There's stuff everywhere, right? So why does any part of this process have to be sterile? The answer is that in nature, 99.99% of spores that land somewhere don't work. They don't do anything. They don't have the right conditions. They get outcompeted by something else. Something eats them. They just, so nature has an extremely high failure rate for mushrooms. When we're growing mushrooms, we don't want the same failure rate. If you wanted to do things and not have it be sterile and have 1 out of every 1,000 bags work out nicely for you, you're welcome to not use sterility. But sterility is really important if you want 999 of those bags to work and have 1 contaminate. So that's the importance of sterility when we're growing versus when stuff is just out in nature. Can I grow psychedelic mushrooms using these techniques? The techniques are different for psychedelic mushrooms versus these mushrooms. I'm not going to go into all the differences. I'm not going to go into how to produce psychedelic mushrooms. You can look it up on shroomery.org. Your call if you want to go that direction. I don't endorse it myself, but the techniques are very different. There's a very different set of techniques, and the two do not cross over well with each other. They've been developed separately. There's a little bit of crossover here and there. One of the things you'll find as you're searching for articles, as you're searching for information, as you're pulling up additional stuff, is this word tech, T-E-K. It's a special spelling of technique. I think at some point it stood for something. I have no idea what it stands for. But if you see tech, there's a strong possibility that what you're dealing with is like an early 90s forum post about psychedelic mushrooms. And so be very wary of tech. Sometimes it gets applied to gourmet stuff and it works fine. But just know that the techniques do not cross over between the two very well as you're searching for stuff. So if you see the word tech, it's something to be a little bit wary of. You don't want to just jump into using that. So I believe that is the end of the slideshow here. If anybody has any additional questions, okay. Okay. Oh, you missed the puns. Got any for the finale? No, I don't think we have mushroom left for puns. But all right, that's that's it for me, folks. Thank you so much for attending. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate all the questions. Thanks for making it interactive. That was phenomenal. You'll get a copy of this presentation. My email address is on there. You can also find me on Facebook. If you have any additional questions or you start to get into it and you're like, I wish I had asked them that, feel free, reach out. I am here. I am more than willing to answer questions about mushrooms. I love talking about this stuff. So thank you all. I appreciate it and have a wonderful evening.